Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. Most of the stories we tell on this channel have a shape you can follow. Man arrives. Man meets woman. Money moves in one direction. Man goes home with less than he came with and more than he bargained for in terms of an education. The arc is familiar, and there's a reason we keep telling it. Because it keeps happening, and because the details matter, and because every version of it is different enough to be worth hearing. But every so often we get a story that doesn't fit that shape cleanly. And those are the ones I think that stay with you longest. Declan Moran is 54 years old. He's from County Roscommon in the Irish Midlands, not a place that features heavily in romantic escape narratives, which is perhaps part of the point. He spent 25 years as an accountant, and he is, by his own description, a man who has spent his professional life making sure the numbers tell the truth. He came to Da Nang because the numbers said he could. He stayed because something happened that the numbers couldn't account for. And what he came home with, 11 months later, sitting on a flight back to Dublin, was something he's still trying to find the right column for. This one's going to stay with you, not because it ends in catastrophe, but because it doesn't. And somehow that's harder. Here's his story, in his own words. The building supplies firm in Athlone smelled of two things, permanently and without variation: cement dust, and the particular kind of toner you get from a photocopier that's been overworked since 2009, and nobody's ever serviced properly. 25 years I walked into that smell. I stopped noticing it somewhere around year 4, the way you stop noticing things that are simply the condition of your life. Then the firm closed, and I cleared my desk, and I went home. And my flat, the flat I was living in by then, not the house, the flat, had no smell at all, and somehow that was worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine, professionally and otherwise. The career was what it was. I was good at it, not brilliant. I want to be clear on that distinction because I think it matters to who I am. Brilliant accountants go to the big firms in Dublin, the multinationals, the financial services sector. I went to Connaught Building Supplies in Athlone because they needed someone reliable, and reliable was something I could do consistently and without much drama. Payroll, VAT returns, quarterly forecasts for a company that sold concrete blocks and roof trusses, and in particularly exciting quarters, specialist drainage solutions. I was the man they called when the auditors were coming. That's not nothing. It's also not a story you tell at dinner parties. The marriage was good. I want to say that too because I don't think it serves anyone to pretend otherwise. 22 years. Siobhan and Aoife, our daughters, born in 96 and 99. A house outside Roscommon town that we painted twice and never quite finished the back garden of. It was a life. A real one. The kind where nothing much happens and then you look up and 15 years have gone by and you think, well, that was fine, wasn't it? And then my wife left me for a man from her book club. One have said that sentence probably 40 times now. It doesn't get funnier, but it doesn't get more painful either. It's just a fact, like a number that doesn't balance. I went back over it the way I go back over accounts that don't reconcile, looking for where the error crept in. I never quite found it, which is either very honest or very dishonest of me, depending on your perspective. The settlement came through in March of 2022. My solicitor sent me a bill 2 weeks later that was, I think I can say without exaggeration, the first invoice in my professional career I genuinely could not find a way to dispute. Every line item was accurate. That was the galling part. Then, in July, 4 months later, because the universe apparently felt the first quarter had gone too smoothly, the firm announced a restructure. My position and 3 others were made redundant. The managing director shook my hand and said I'd been a tremendous asset to the company, which is the kind of thing people say when they mean the opposite of what they're saying, and which I, after 25 years in a room adjacent to the finances, had always known. I received my redundancy package, cleared the desk, went back to the flat. The flat was in Athlone. 1 bedroom. The sitting room had a window that faced a car park. I had, by this point, in the space of about 14 months, lost the house, the marriage, the job, and somewhere in the background, quietly, the sense that the shape of my life was one I'd had any hand in designing. I didn't, as people sometimes suggest, fall apart. I'm not built for falling apart. What I did was make a spreadsheet. It started as a financial exercise, which savings, which pension entitlements, what I'd need per month to sustain myself somewhere with a lower cost of living than Ireland. which is not a particularly high bar to be fair. I had 68,000 euros liquid, the redundancy package, plus a small inheritance from my father that I'd never touched, because there was always a reason not to touch it, and I couldn't decide what reason was sufficient. I had a partial occupational pension that would kick in properly when I turned 60, and I had two small Irish businesses, a solicitor's office in Roscommon and a plant hire company in Longford, who'd already asked whether I'd consider doing their books remotely on a contract basis. At roughly 800 euros a month between them, that was something. I found the Facebook group at about 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in September. Expats in Da Nang. So I'd been reading forums about Portugal, Thailand, Spain. I'd looked at Malta. I'd spent an evening researching the Canary Islands with the grim thoroughness of a man who needs there to be an answer at the end of the process. The Da Nang group had a quality I found immediately suspicious, which was that everyone in it seemed unreasonably content. Men my age posting photographs of fresh seafood they'd eaten for 4 euros. Apartments with sea views going for 600 a month. Endless commentary on the weather, as though weather were a personality trait these men had recently discovered they possessed. I read it the way I'd read any document of uncertain provenance, with interest and skepticism in roughly equal measure, but the numbers checked out. I ran them properly, built the model, stress tested it. On 68,000 euros plus the pension plus the contract work, I could sustain myself in Da Nang for 2 years without touching the capital. 3 years if I was careful, which I am, constitutionally and by training. The projection held up. I told myself it was a financial decision. I have a spreadsheet to prove it. I booked a flight in February. I packed 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. In the laptop bag, I put one photograph of my daughters. From a Christmas a few years back, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I put it face down. I don't know exactly why I did that. I moved on to packing my chargers. The plane landed at Da Nang International on a Thursday morning in March, and the heat came through the jetway door like something physical, like a wall made of warmth rather than materials. Tina and I stood there for a moment with my carry-on and thought, I have done something. I cannot yet tell you whether it was brave or foolish. Possibly both. Possibly neither. But I have done something, and I am here. And the numbers say this is manageable. That's where I was. 54 years old, standing in the arrivals hall of a city I'd found on Facebook at 2 in the morning, with 68,000 euros and a photograph I'd put face down. The numbers said manageable. That much was true. The apartment was on a side street off An Thuong, which is the area just back from my K Beach where the guest houses thin out and you start getting actual residential buildings. 6th floor, 15 million jong a month, which worked out to roughly 560 euros. I'd budgeted 580 euros, so I considered this a small win and filed it accordingly. The apartment itself was fine. More than fine, actually. By the standards of what I'd been living in Athlone, it was significantly better. 2 rooms, a proper kitchen, a balcony I could stand on in the mornings with a coffee and watch the city start itself up. From the bathroom window, if you stood at the right angle and craned slightly to the left, you could see a corner of the sea. I mention this because I told my daughter Chauvin about the sea view, and I want to be accurate about the extent to which that was true. The first week I got the basics sorted. SIM card, a Grab account on my phone, figured out the nearest place to buy water and where the decent breakfast spots were along the beach road. I set up my laptop and did 4 hours of bookkeeping for the solicitor's office in Roscommon, each which felt genuinely strange. Reconciling VAT records for a practice in County Roscommon, while a motorbike horn went off somewhere below and the humidity sat on everything like a second skin. But the work was there, and I did it, and that gave the mornings a shape. The afternoons were harder. I want to be honest about this because I think it matters. The Facebook group posts had all been about the food and the weather and the cost of living. And they were right about all of those things, but what they hadn't mentioned, or what I hadn't read carefully enough, was the particular quality of the silence in a foreign city when you don't know anyone and there's nothing that needs doing. In Athlone, even in the worst months after the divorce, there was always something that needed doing. Here, by 2:30 on most days, there wasn't. I took to walking. Not adventurously. I want to be clear that I am not an adventurous man, and there was nothing in me at that point that was looking for adventure. I walked because it was better than sitting in the apartment watching the ceiling. and because the city was loud enough that the silence inside my own head became less audible. I walked further from the beach strip as the weeks went on. The tourist end of things had a quality I found faintly dispiriting. The menus with photographs, the staff who switched to English before you'd opened your mouth, the general atmosphere of a place that had arranged itself for someone else's benefit. I wasn't looking for authenticity in some romanticized sense. I just wanted to be somewhere that wasn't performing for me. I found Lynn on a Tuesday at lunchtime, about 3 weeks in. It's on a small street that runs parallel to the Han River, maybe a 10-minute walk from the bridge. The kind of street where the power lines tangle overhead, and there are potted plants outside doorways, and a man fixing motorbikes takes up half the footpath without anyone appearing to mind. No English sign. Plastic stools, the low kind that put your knees somewhere near your chin if you're a certain height, which I am. A handwritten menu on a laminated sheet that I could not read a single word of. I sat down anyway. A woman came over, not Lynn, her mother, though I didn't know that yet, and waited with the patient. Assessing expression of someone who has dealt with confused foreigners before, and has made her peace with it. I pointed at what the man at the next table was eating. She nodded, wrote something down, went away. What arrived was a bowl of Bun Bo Hue, spicy beef noodle soup with lemongrass and shrimp paste and a complexity of flavor that I genuinely was not prepared for at 12:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. In my third week of living in a country I'd found on Facebook, I ate the whole thing. I sat there for a moment after, with the broth smell still in the air and the street noise coming in through the open front, and thought, well, that's something. I went back the next day, and the day after. It was on the third visit that I properly noticed the woman running the front of house. I'd been aware of her. You'd have to be. She had a quality of presence that the room organized itself around. The way restaurants sometimes have a person who is clearly the actual reason everything functions. But on the third visit, she brought my order over herself rather than leaving it to the older woman. And she said something in Vietnamese, and then, when I looked blank, said in English quite clearly, "You like it? The soup?" I said I did. She nodded as though this confirmed something and went back to work. Her name was Lynn. I found this out from a Zalo message she sent me 3 days later. She'd written her number on a small piece of paper with the bill on the Friday visit, which I'd assumed was standard practice until I mentioned it to another expat at a coffee place near my apartment, and he gave me a look that suggested it was not. The message was just her name and a smiley face. Lynn. As I stared at it for a longer time than was probably reasonable. Here's what I want to tell you, and I want to be careful about how I say this. I had, before going back on that 6th or 7th visit, read a thread on one of the expat forums. A long one, titled something like, How to Know If She's Genuine. I read the whole thing, I made mental notes. The warning signs were mostly variations on, she asks for money quickly, she has a complicated family situation she mentions early, she's overly available. She pushes toward commitment faster than feels natural, she works in a bar or tourist area. I went through the list against what I'd observed. She hadn't asked for anything. She worked in a family restaurant that didn't have an English sign. She'd given me her number once, sent one message, and then left the next move entirely to me. And she ran the place with an efficiency that had nothing performative about it. She directed her mother and her younger brother with the calm authority of someone who has been doing this a long time and is not trying to impress anyone. She didn't match a single item on the list. And I remember thinking, on the walk back to my apartment that evening, that this was reassuring. I ought to have thought harder about what it meant that I'd been looking for reasons to proceed rather than reasons to stop. That's the honest version. I didn't think harder about it. I sent a message back. We agreed to meet for coffee on the Sunday. Not at the restaurant. She suggested a place on Tran Phu, a coffee shop called somewhere I can't spell from memory, but which had proper chairs and a ceiling fan, and served the kind of cafe suaja that is genuinely one of the better things I've encountered in my 54 years of existence. That was the first time we talked properly. Her English was workable, better than she presented it at the restaurant, which I noted but didn't interrogate. My Vietnamese was 4 phrases from a YouTube video, one of which I had apparently been pronouncing in a way that meant something different from what I intended, though she didn't tell me this until later. We got through 2 hours mostly intact, with some gaps that we filled with gestures and the occasional translated word on her phone screen. She was 38, divorced, one son Coy, 14, Ike studying for his secondary exams and apparently taking them very seriously. She co-ran the restaurant with her mother, Balan, and her younger brother Min, who was 26, and who she described, with a brief expression I couldn't entirely read, as helping sometimes. I told her I was from Ireland. She knew it was in Europe. I said it rained a lot. She laughed, it was a good laugh. Direct, unperformed. She wasn't doing anything with it. I told my daughter Awafa that evening that I'd found a good local restaurant and was getting to know some of the neighborhood. Which was true. Completely true. That's all I said. The Sunday coffees became a standing arrangement without either of us formally deciding that. The third one, I paid. The fourth. She arrived with a small bag of banh mi from a place near the restaurant. Pork and pâté, wrapped in paper, still warm, and set it on the table between us without comment, as though this were already an established thing we did. Maybe it was by then. I can't identify the exact moment it became that. I want to try to explain what the early weeks of it felt like because I think this is the part that's hardest to convey without sounding either naive or deliberately obtuse, and I was neither. I went into this with my guard up. I knew the general shape of the stories. I'd read enough of the forums to understand the architecture of how these situations typically develop. The warmth that arrives too quickly, the need that presents itself just as you've relaxed, this calm with the sense that you're being managed by someone who is better at this than you are. I was watching for it, and what I kept finding, instead, was something that didn't match. She split the bill on the second coffee. I had to argue her out of it on the third. This is not a small detail. I'd been told fairly consistently that money flows in one direction from the start in these situations. And here was a woman on a modest income from a family restaurant insisting on paying her share of a coffee and a slice of bon flan at a place on Tran. I noticed it, filed it. About 3 weeks into the Sunday arrangement, she brought me to the restaurant for lunch on a day when it was closed to the public. Her mother cooked. Not the regular menu, something different. A clay pot of kakotu, braised fish with ginger and caramel. The kind of dish that takes time and doesn't appear on laminated sheets. Balan came out of the kitchen twice, looked at me assessingly both times, spoke to Lynn in a rapid Vietnamese I had no purchase on, and then on the second visit apparently said something that made Lynn respond quietly and at length. I asked afterwards what that had been about. Lynn said she wanted to know if you were serious. I asked what she'd said in reply. She said, I told her I didn't know yet. I respected that answer. Still do? Coy, I met a week or so after that. 14. Serious in the way that Vietnamese secondary students often are when exams are approaching, which they always seem to be. He shook my hand with the formal solemnity of a boy who has been told to be polite to his mother's guest, and is taking the instructions seriously. He spoke no English worth mentioning. I spoke no Vietnamese worth mentioning. We sat at the same table for a Sunday lunch and communicated primarily through Lynn translating, and the mutual understanding that we were both doing our best. He went back to studying afterwards. I thought, that's a well-raised kid. This is the thing about those months that I still struggle to account for cleanly. Lynn talked about money, directly, specifically, in a way I hadn't expected. She told me the restaurant's lease terms, how long they had, what the renewal clause looked like, what the landlord had been hinting about. She told me about the school fees for Koi, what they cost per term, how she managed it. She told me about the challenge of keeping Min reliable, not dramatically, just as a fact of the business she was running. She didn't frame any of this as a request. She framed it as information, the way you'd talk to someone you were starting to consider a real person in your life rather than a guest. A woman who is setting you up does not tell you unprompted what her lease terms are. That's what I thought. Maybe I was right. Maybe that's not an either-or question. I'm still working it out. The financial involvement in that period was ordinary, genuinely ordinary. Meals because we were going out and I was the one with more money, and this is how things work. A grab here and there. In June, a weekend in Hoi An, 2 nights at a small guest house just off the Old Town, about 800,000 jong a night, roughly 30 euros each, which was considerably less than I'd have paid for a comparable room in any city I could name in Western Europe. We walked along Nguyen Thai Hoc Street in the evening, past the lantern shops with their reflections in the Thuban River, and had Kamga at a place her cousin had recommended, and drank tiger beer on plastic stools and watched the boats. The whole weekend came to about 300 euros, including travel and every meal. And I remember sitting there on the second evening thinking, I would have paid more. I would have paid considerably more for this specific 36 hours. I'm not a romantic man, or at least I haven't thought of myself as one. I mention this because what I felt in Hoi An was not romance in the way I'd have recognized it. It was more like being present, being in a moment rather than calculating it. I think I had spent quite a long time calculating moments as a professional habit, and this was different. Then we came back to Jia Nang, and about 2 weeks later, Min happened. Lynn brought it up on an evening at the apartment. She was uncomfortable, genuinely uncomfortable, the kind you can tell because the person is actively not looking at you while they explain. Min's motorbike had needed a repair he hadn't budgeted for. He was also short on rent for the month. He needed 12 million jong, about 450 euros. Could she, and she hesitated here visibly, could she borrow it? B and she would pay it back from the restaurant when the month was better. I did, in fairness to myself, do a brief mental assessment. I thought 450 euros. I thought she asked to borrow it, not take it. I thought the fact that she's embarrassed about asking is itself meaningful information. I thought 450 euros is not real money when you're sitting on 68,000 euros. And I thought, I want to be the kind of man who helps when he can. That last one. That's the one I'd watch more carefully if I were doing it again. I said yes without hesitation. She said thank you in a way that seemed to cost her something. I filed the amount in my mental ledger under loan with the private acknowledgement that the category was probably notional. I want to pause here because there's something I should tell you. And around this time, maybe a week or two after the min payment, I realized I had stopped reading the expat forums. I'd been reading them regularly since before I left Ireland. Not obsessively, but consistently the way you maintain a professional habit, because it keeps you informed. And then one evening, I went to open the browser tab and realized I hadn't been there in 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I thought at the time that this was a positive sign. Evidence that I'd settled, that I was living the life rather than researching it. I understand now that this is exactly when you should start reading them again. That the moment you stop looking for the thing is not the moment you're safe from it. It's the moment you've stopped counting. Haifi rang that week. She asked how things were going, whether I'd met anyone. I said I'd met some interesting people and was getting on well. She asked whether interesting people included anyone in particular. I said it was early days and I'd tell her more when there was more to tell, which was true. And also not the whole truth. But that's where I was. By July, the relationship had acquired the texture of something domestic. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that because domestic is a word that can sound like a complaint, and it isn't. It means she stayed at the apartment 2 or 3 nights a week and nobody had discussed this specifically. It means I knew how she took her safe suaja and she knew I needed 20 minutes of quiet in the morning before I was fit for conversation. It means I had a key to the restaurant's back entrance because I occasionally arrived before she'd unlocked the front. But we hadn't decided any of this. It just became the arrangement. The way things do when nobody objects and both parties find it preferable to the alternative. I don't think either of us decided. That's the truest way to put it. Her family had absorbed me in a manner I found both touching and, in retrospect, worth examining. Balan, Lynn's mother, 63, permanently in motion, the actual engine of the kitchen operation, had progressed from assessing me with frank suspicion to acknowledging me with a nod to what I can only describe as adopting me with the warm pragmatism of a woman who approves of a man who shows up and doesn't cause drama. She pressed things into my hands when I left the restaurant. Small packages of dried lemongrass, a portion of cheba mao she'd made too much of. Once, at the end of a Sunday, ate a small wrapped sweet that I didn't recognize and which turned out, when I asked Lynn, to be something traditionally given to people you're glad to have around. I held on to that information a bit too tightly, probably. There was a family gathering in August. A cousin's wedding anniversary, held at a house in Saint-Tra with a garden that spilled out toward the water and tables set up under string lights with about 40 people who spoke, collectively, perhaps 80 words of English. I was the only Thai present. I sat at a table and smiled for 4 hours and ate things I couldn't identify, and drank 333 beer poured into glasses of ice, and managed, through some combination of goodwill and the universal social grammar of people who are making an effort, to get through the evening without disgracing anyone. And at the end of the night, Balan pressed a wrapped sweet into my palm. the same gesture as before, and said something to me directly that she'd never done before. In Vietnamese, I had no chance with. I looked at Lynn. She said, "She's glad you came." I said I was glad to be there. Both statements were true. I think that evening was the point at which my professional skepticism became genuinely difficult to maintain. And I think, in hindsight, that this is worth noting. Not because the skepticism had been misplaced, but because difficulty maintaining it is not the same as it being wrong. Min, I should describe properly because I keep mentioning him in passing, and he deserves more accurate accounting than that. 26. Slim, quick-moving, try with the specific restless energy of a person who is always either about to do something or having just done something, with a notable absence of whatever occupies the middle. Lynn never complained about him, not directly, but there was a quality in the way she mentioned him that I recognized, the slightly careful word choice, the brief pause before certain sentences, that I use myself when I'm describing a situation I have complicated feelings about but am not going to fully express. He worked at the restaurant intermittently. He had other projects that were never entirely specified. He was 26 and things happened to him. In September, Balan's knee became a problem. She'd been managing what Lynn described as an old injury. But in September it stopped being manageable and became something that required a private clinic consultation. I went with them. This was my choice, not a request. I offered, because it seemed like the right thing to do and because I had nothing else that afternoon, and because by this point going with Lynn to things felt natural. The clinic was off Nguyen Van Lin, clean and well organized, the kind of private facility in Gia Nang that exists specifically because the public hospitals are challenging and anyone with options prefers not to use them. The doctor was thorough. The knee needed a procedure. The bill came to 28 million jong, roughly 1,050 euros. Lynn paid 14 million of it herself. In cash from an envelope she'd brought, she insisted on this. I offered to cover the full amount and she said no. She'd cover half. How and could I cover the rest? I said yes immediately. And I want to dwell on this for a moment because I've thought about it a great deal since. A woman who is running a calculated extraction does not pay 520 euros of her own money toward her mother's medical bill when the man she's extracting from has already offered to cover everything. Or maybe she does, because 520 euros buys a very convincing performance. I genuinely don't know which interpretation is correct. I genuinely think both are possible simultaneously, which is perhaps the most disorienting conclusion I've arrived at in this whole accounting. And then Min came back. This was October, a business opportunity. The description was vague in a way I noticed, but chose not to interrogate. Something involving a small import arrangement with a contact he had, startup costs modest, a short-term commitment. He needed 8 million jong, about 300 euros. He'd pay it back in 6 weeks. I paid. And here's the thing I want to say carefully, because I think it's the most honest part of this whole story. When the first request came, the motorbike, the 450 euros, I ran an assessment. I thought it through. I arrived at a conclusion through a process. When this second request came, I didn't do that. I just paid. And I noticed, in the moment of paying, that I was no longer applying the process. I noticed it the way you notice a change in procedure at work. You register it, make a mental note, intend to review it at some point, and then you move on. In any professional context, a second loan request from the same party with no evidence of repayment of the first would trigger a formal review. I would have written a memo. I did not write a memo. There were 2 evenings in October where Lynn canceled with reasons I couldn't properly interrogate because my Vietnamese wasn't sufficient, and the reasons, when translated through Zalo messages, were thin in a way I felt but couldn't articulate. She seemed stressed in ways that didn't fully surface. I didn't ask directly, partly because direct questions about stress felt wrong in this cultural register. I'd learned enough by then to know that problems often go unspoken, that pressing for explicit answers can be its own kind of offense. And partly, and this is the honest part, partly because one didn't want the answer. Both things were true. Chauvin rang in late October to ask if I was coming home for Christmas. I told her I'd have to see how things stood. She asked what things. I said the general situation, the work schedule, the cost of flights. She said, Dad, are you all right? And I said, yes, I'm genuinely all right, which was true. And it was also not a complete answer to the question she was asking. One evening in late September, I was sitting on the apartment balcony with Lynn after the restaurant had closed. John Nang does this thing in the evening where the motorbike noise drops by maybe 30%, and the heat becomes less insistent and the lights along the Han River go on. And for a period of maybe 2 hours, it is one of the most livable cities you can imagine being in. We were sitting with cups of tea. She'd started making tea at the apartment, buying a specific brand I couldn't read the label of from a shop near the restaurant. And she said something in Vietnamese that I didn't catch. I asked what it meant. She was quiet for a moment. She said something like, "It's enough for now." I thought about that for a while. I decided to take it at face value. It was probably accurate as a translation. It was probably also not the whole meaning, but it was enough for then. By November, I had been in Da Nang for 8 months, and the life was, by any reasonable measure, functioning. The remote work was steady. The solicitor's office in Roscommon had added a third monthly reconciliation, which brought the contract income to just over €900, slightly better than I'd projected. My monthly costs were running at roughly €1,400 all in. The apartment, food, transport, the occasional beer at a place near the beach where I'd sometimes sit for an hour with a tiger on ice and watch the motorbikes go by on Vuon Nguyen Giap. Not the bars that cater to tourists, not the backpacker strip. Just a local place with plastic tables and a television showing football I didn't follow. I was, in the language of the spreadsheet, on track. Slightly over on social costs, but within acceptable variance. Lynn brought up the restaurant situation on a Thursday evening. We were at the apartment. She'd cooked a simple buokam, rice and a fried egg, and some morning glory with garlic that she'd assembled in about 12 minutes, and which was considerably better than anything I could have produced in twice the time. She mentioned the landlord first. The lease on the restaurant space was coming up for renewal in February, and he was increasing the rent. Not dramatically, but meaningfully, enough to affect the margins. The kitchen equipment was also aging. The gas burners needed replacing, and there was a refrigeration unit that had been failing intermittently since July. And then there was Min. She didn't explain that part further, not that evening. She just said there were some things with Min in the restaurant arrangement that needed to be resolved. That was all. She changed the subject, asked about the plant hire company in Longford whose books I'd been doing that afternoon, and we talked about something else. I recognized the structure of what had just happened. I want to be clear about this. I recognized it in real time, not in retrospect. I have spent 25 years preparing briefing documents and supporting memoranda, and I know what the explanatory memo looks like when it precedes a proposal. You lay the groundwork first, you establish the context. You let the information settle before you make the ask. It's good practice. I use it myself. The second evening was a week later. This time she was more specific. The landlord wanted 20% more on the lease. The kitchen equipment would cost approximately 60 million jong to replace properly, about €2,200. And Min, it emerged, held a share of the business formally, an arrangement from when the restaurant had started, and which had made sense at the time, but no longer did. And he was willing to sell his share if someone bought him out. The figure for everything together, the lease deposit increase, the kitchen equipment, the buyout of Min's share, was 180 million jong, just under €6,800. She didn't ask directly. She laid out the situation and said she was trying to work out how to manage it, that she had some savings but not enough, and that she was telling me because she told me things now, which I understood to mean that this was what people who were genuinely in each other's lives did. She was not performing distress. She was not crying. She was explaining a business problem with the same direct manner she'd used when she'd told me the lease terms 4 months earlier, and I still find, that consistency meaningful. Performed helplessness is a different thing. This was not that. She said, I understand if you can't. I'm not asking you to fix it. But she was, of course. And we both knew it. And I told her I'd think about it. I built the spreadsheet over 4 days. I was thorough about it. Genuinely thorough, not performatively thorough. I looked at the restaurant's actual turnover, which she'd shown me the figures for without hesitation. And I modeled what 20% more rent would do to the margins, with and without the equipment upgrade. I looked at what eliminating Min's share would mean for operational decision-making, which was genuinely significant. He had been a source of ongoing friction that I had witnessed and underestimated. The numbers, taken on their own terms, were not unreasonable. A going business, a real asset, a genuine opportunity to consolidate ownership. On the fourth day, I closed the laptop. I knew, before I'd opened it, what I was going to do. The spreadsheet was not the thing that decided it. The spreadsheet was the process I used to give myself permission for the decision I'd already made. I am honest enough to tell you that now. A man who builds a 4-day spreadsheet to decide whether to give someone 6,800 euros is not a man conducting due diligence. He's a man who has already decided and is doing the paperwork afterward. I transferred the money. 180 million zhong, sent through the account we'd been using for shared expenses, with a note I kept deliberately vague because I wasn't sure how I'd feel about having it in writing. I want to name the blind spots, because I think that's the useful part of telling this story. The professional training worked against me. 25 years of extending credit had taught me to trust process. If the analysis supports it, proceed. But the analysis only works if the inputs are accurate, and I had no independent way to verify the inputs. I was trusting the figures she showed me because I trusted her, which is a circular form of reasoning I would not have accepted from anyone else. The post-divorce emotional state worked against me, and I needed this to be real in a way that I wasn't fully accounting for in my assessment of whether it was. The need to have it be real was itself a variable I wasn't including. And the Irish stoicism worked against me. If I'd had questions, I'd have asked them. I didn't ask them. I told myself this was respect for the cultural register, which is true as far as it goes. But it also goes only as far as I needed it to. December arrived, and the renovation began. New tiles appeared in the front section of the restaurant. There was noise from the kitchen area when I passed, the sound of work being done. I walked past twice and noted the progress and did not go in to check. I told myself I wasn't the kind of man who checks up on people. I have since revised my view on what that instinct is actually protecting. Min became less visible, and I read this as a resolution of the situation. I understand now it was a completion of it. I didn't fly home for Christmas. I told myself the flights were expensive relative to the projection model, which was partially true. Lynn worked over the holiday period as restaurants do. Balan had me over in late December as the Tet preparations began. The cleaning, the specific foods being prepared, the offering placed on the family altar in the front room with incense that smelled of sandalwood, and something else I couldn't name. I sat at the kitchen table and helped where I could and understood about 30% of what was being said, and found the whole thing, without qualification, genuinely moving. On New Year's Eve, we walked to the Han River. It was warm, the way Jia Nang is always warm, even when there were people everywhere along the riverfront, and the Dragon Bridge was lit up, and at midnight the fireworks went off over the water and reflected in it simultaneously, so you had fireworks above and below at once. I was happy, unambiguously, in the moment, and without the calculation that usually accompanies my experience of things. I want to be clear about that because the happiness was real and it's part of the honest accounting of this. I stood there with Lynn and watched the fireworks and was happy. And that is a fact that sits alongside all the other facts and doesn't cancel any of them out. A Wei-Fei rang just after midnight. She asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it completely. She said, "You sound different." I said I was watching fireworks. She said, "Good, Dad. That's good." It was January when things began to come clear. There's a feeling I recognize from professional experience. Not panic, not alarm, more like the low-grade unease that settles in before you've found the specific problem. Like knowing a set of accounts doesn't balance before you've located the discrepancy. You just feel it in the aggregate somewhere below the level of conscious analysis, and you find yourself going back over things you've already checked. That's January. The relationship was warm. Lynn was present. Balan fed me on Sundays. The renovation was progressing. I could see it when I walked past, the new tiles, some work visible through the kitchen door. Nothing had overtly changed, and yet I was going back over things. I tried to diagnose it logically the way I would a balance sheet anomaly. I itemized what I had. A functioning relationship. 8 consecutive months of consistent behavior. A woman who had paid half her mother's medical bill and argued me out of paying for coffee. I itemized what was creating the unease. Nothing specific, just the pattern underneath things accumulated without being named. I let it sit, told myself it was nothing, went about the days. The bar near my K where I met Fraser was not a sophisticated place. Craft beer, a few imported taps, the kind of establishment that exists in every beach city in Southeast Asia, because eventually Western men need somewhere to sit that has more than one English speaker and serves something other than tiger. I went there occasionally, not regularly. It was a Thursday in late January, the kind of evening where the heat has dropped enough that sitting outside is genuinely pleasant. And I went because I wanted English conversation without the effort of arranging it. Fraser was at the bar, 51, Scottish, from Fife originally, though he'd been based in Edinburgh before leaving. 2 years in Jianning, working remotely in IT infrastructure for a firm in Aberdeen that had agreed to let him work from anywhere after the pandemic. He was compact, precise in the way he spoke, with the specific quality of a man who doesn't say things for effect. I assessed him within about 10 minutes as someone whose stated position on any matter would be close to his actual position. That assessment turned out to be correct. We talked about the city for a while. The cost of living increases since 2020, which were real and which had recalibrated the original calculations that brought most of us here. And the visa situation, my e-visa had been renewed twice without difficulty, though there was always a low-level awareness that the rules could change, that the status of long-stay foreigners in Vietnam was ultimately contingent in a way it isn't in countries with proper retirement visas. The expat community dynamics, which Fraser described with the flat accuracy of a man who has watched them long enough to have no illusions. The bitter old-timers, the newly arrived enthusiasts, the small group of people who genuinely built something sustainable. He placed himself in the third category without self-congratulation, which I found credible. The conversation about the city drifted, as these conversations do, toward specifics. Favorite places, regular haunts. I mentioned the restaurant near the Han River, the Bun Bo Hu, and in the way you mention places you are emotionally attached to. Slightly more detail than the question requires. Fraser was quiet for a moment. I know that particular silence. It's the silence of a man deciding how much to say. I've been in enough difficult business conversations to recognize it. The pause before someone tells you something you probably won't want to hear but that they've decided you need to. I waited. He was not a gossip. I want to be clear about this because it matters to why I believed him. He framed what he said carefully, prefaced it by saying he might be overstepping, said he wasn't certain of all of it, and I should take it accordingly. Then he told me two things. The first, Lynn's ex-husband appeared at the restaurant regularly, not as an occasional visitor or a practical necessity around Khoi. Regularly, and in ways that Fraser, who had eaten there, who knew the street, described as inconsistent with a clean separation. He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. The second, a Dutch man named Joost. He'd left Jianning about 6 months before I arrived. Had been in a relationship with Lynn for some months prior to leaving. Had contributed money toward a restaurant renovation. And the restaurant, in the period between Joost leaving and Declan arriving, had not visibly received a renovation. Fraser finished by saying, I'm not saying I know what happened. I'm just saying what I observed. I thanked him. I finished my beer. I paid. We exchanged numbers, though I haven't used his since. I walked home along Vod Nguyen Giap, the beach road which takes about 30 minutes from that part of the strip. And during those 30 minutes I had a conversation with myself that I had been postponing for several weeks. By the time I reached the apartment, the conversation was finished. I opened the laptop. I built a transaction timeline. Every payment I could document. The Min motorbike loan, the clinic, the second Min payment, the restaurant renovation, the cumulative smaller amounts, meals absorbed into shared costs that probably weren't shared, a grab fare here, a contribution to something there. I was methodical. I am always methodical. The total across 11 months came to 9,300 euros. I sat with the spreadsheet for a long time. The way I used to sit with accounts that wouldn't reconcile. Not emotional, just working, waiting to find the error. There was no error. The numbers were accurate. The column balanced. And the balance was not in my favor. I didn't call Fraser. I didn't do anything that night except close the laptop and go to bed, which is, I think, the most honest indication I can give you of my state of mind. There was nothing dramatic left to do. The week that followed had a specific texture. I saw Lynn twice, a Wednesday evening at the restaurant, a Sunday lunch that Ba Lan cooked. Both times warm, unchanged, normal, which was its own complicated data point. Either nothing had changed from her side, or nothing needed to change because nothing from her side had ever been what I'd understood it to be. I couldn't determine which. I considered confrontation and thought it through as I would a formal dispute process. If she admits it, I lose something I can't recover, which is the version of events where she was genuine. But if she denies it, I gain nothing, because denial is not evidence. If she cries and I believe her, I'm back where I started, which is to say, back in a situation where I've already decided I can't remain. There was no branch of the decision tree that produced a useful outcome. Confrontation was not, in this case, a tool that could accomplish anything. I booked the flight on a Tuesday morning, February Dublin. I told Lynn that evening, at the apartment, not the restaurant, which felt important to me, though I couldn't have explained precisely why. Some residual sense that the decision should happen in a space that was mine. She cried. I watched because I'm the kind of man who watches, and I concluded that the crying was genuine. I still believe this. Both things can be true. The crying genuine? Aye, the money gone. And I've spent enough time since trying to resolve that contradiction to know it doesn't resolve. Some accounts don't balance. You close them anyway. Balan came. Lynn must have called her because I hadn't said anything and Balan arrived from the kitchen within 20 minutes, which meant she'd been on the way already. She held my hand. She said something at length in Vietnamese, looking directly at me with the particular seriousness of someone delivering something they want to make sure is received. Lynn translated after a pause that was longer than translation requires. She said, "She says you are a good man." I believed the translation. I believed the sentiment. I also believed the 9,300 euros was gone and probably had been from before I arrived. All three things were true simultaneously, and the honest accounting of this whole experience is that I have not found a way to make them contradict each other. The flight was 11 hours with a connection in Doha. I sat in the window seat and looked at the darkness outside and did the accounting the way I always do when there's nothing else to occupy the part of my mind that needs to be occupied. 56,000 euros remaining, 11 months. A working knowledge of Vietnamese food vocabulary that is, I will admit, of limited practical utility in County Roscommon. Dublin Airport in February is a particular experience. Cold in the specific way that Irish cold is. Not dramatic, just relentless. The kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck immediately and stays there. Gray light through the terminal windows. Cue the baggage carousel moving with the patient indifference of all baggage carousels everywhere. The other passengers around me with the particular expression of people who have returned from somewhere warmer and are managing mild bereavement about it. A wife who was waiting in the arrivals hall. She's 26 now, works for an insurance company in Galway, drove 2 hours to meet me at the airport on a Tuesday morning without being asked. I saw her before she saw me, and I stood for a moment with my bag and thought, this is the thing I packed face down. We drove to Athlone. She made tea. She asked how I was. I said I was fine, which was true in the way that fine is always partially true. I sat in her kitchen, the flat she shares with 2 colleagues, a corner unit with good windows and a view of the car park opposite, and felt, for the first time in 11 months, that I was in a room that recognized me, which is a strange sensation. I hadn't known I'd missed it. I didn't tell her the full story. Not that day. I said I'd had a good experience that had also been complicated, and that I'd explain more when I'd worked out how to explain it. She looked at me for a moment. She has her mother's way of reading a room, which I say without bitterness. It's genuinely a useful trait. And then she said, "Okay, Dad," and went to put more biscuits on the plate. Finding the right words is something I'm still working on, partly why I'm telling it now. So let me try to do what I do. Let me audit this properly. Financial, 9,300 euros across 11 months. That's approximately 14% of the 68,000 euros I arrived with. Meaningful, not catastrophic? I have 56,000 euros. The contract work still running at just over 900 euros a month. The pension beginning to draw partially in 6 years. The projection model still holds, adjusted. I have been set back. You're not finished. I want to be precise about that distinction because imprecision in either direction would be dishonest. Time, 11 months. And I refuse. I genuinely refuse to put these in the loss column. They were months in which I was alive in a way I hadn't been in the 2 years preceding them. I walked along the Han River at closing time and stacked chairs in someone else's restaurant because I needed to be useful, and the city let me be useful. I sat at a family table in San Tra for 4 hours and communicated through goodwill alone. I watched fireworks reflected double in the water on New Year's Eve, and was, for a period of approximately 10 minutes, completely without calculation. These are not nothing. The months are not in the loss column. Relational, complicated, and I'll leave it at complicated because I think that's the only category that fits. I've tried to find a cleaner verdict and I can't. She may have cared for me genuinely and still participated in something that cost me money. Both things can be true. Vietnamese family obligation is real. Filial piety, the expectation of support, the way a woman with an unreliable brother and a mother's medical bills and a lease problem navigates those pressures. And it is not the same as calculation, even when the outcome looks similar. I entered a system I didn't understand and funded obligations I'd never agreed to and couldn't have foreseen. And some of that is on her, and some of it is on me for not understanding the system I'd entered. That's the most honest ledger I can produce. So, paradise or overrated? Ja Nang is real. The Boon Bo Hu at Quan Lin is real and extraordinary, and I would eat it again tomorrow. The heat is real. The lights on the Han River at 10 in the evening are real. Balan's hand on mine is real. The Cafe Sua Ja from the street vendor near in Thuong. The specific one on the corner, elderly woman, always the same chair, always the same indifferent nod when you ordered, is real. The 9,300 euros is real. The ex-husband, who was apparently never fully an ex, is real. The Dutch man named Juiced who came before me is real. I hold all of these in the same spreadsheet. They all go in. The numbers were never the problem. I knew the numbers. I'd known the numbers since before I booked the flight, and the numbers throughout were accurate. The problem was asking the numbers to answer a question they couldn't answer, which was whether I was sufficiently recovered from the previous 2 years to be trusted with this particular situation. I came to Ja Nang already broken, and I confused being treated gently with being healed. Those are different things. I know the difference now. I'm not sure I'm certain I knew it then. I'm thinking about going back, not to find Lynn. That column is closed and properly filed. Not to recover anything, because there's nothing to recover, but because the version of myself who walked along the Han River at closing time, stacking chairs he had no obligation to stack in a restaurant that wasn't his, out of pure excess of goodwill, that version is one I find preferable to the one who built projection models at 2 in the morning in a flat facing a car park in Athlone. I haven't booked anything. I have, however, I opened the spreadsheet. That's where we leave Declan Moran, and I think it's the right place to leave him. Somewhere between resolution and possibility, which is the most honest place most of us actually live. Here at Inside Vietnam, we tell a lot of stories about men who lost everything. The dramatic total losses, the full betrayals, the numbers that make your jaw drop. Those stories are real and they're worth telling. But Declan's story is the one I think a lot of you recognize more than you'd like to admit. Not the catastrophe, the middle column, the loss that isn't ruinous but isn't nothing. The relationship that wasn't a fairy tale and also wasn't entirely a fiction. The man who did most things right, who read the forms, who ran the numbers, who kept his guard up, and still ended up somewhere he hadn't expected, losing something he can't cleanly name. A few things Declan's story teaches, if you're willing to learn them. Watch the trend, not just the line items. Any single payment can be rationalized. The pattern is what tells you the truth, and the pattern takes time to see, which is exactly the window that gets exploited. Isolation is a multiplier. Declan knew this in the abstract and discounted it in the specific, which is the most human thing in this whole story. When you're the only person in your life who knows the full picture, there's no one to say, hang on, have you noticed this pattern? And genuine warmth and calculated extraction are not mutually exclusive. This is the hardest lesson and the most important one. If you're waiting for the warmth to feel fake before you apply scrutiny, and you may be waiting past the point where scrutiny can help you, one more thing, and it applies specifically to the Vietnamese context. Filial piety, the deep obligation to support parents and family, is not a performance. It is a genuine cultural reality that shapes how relationships and money work in ways that most Western men are entirely unprepared for. A woman with a struggling family is navigating real obligations that predate you and will outlast you. This doesn't make extraction acceptable. But it does mean that simple villain narratives miss the complexity of what's actually happening. Go in understanding the system. Don't go in assuming it won't apply to you. If this story resonated, leave a comment. We read them. If you've been through something similar and want to share it, the channel is here for exactly that. Just subscribe if you want more honest accounting from the people who've actually been through it. And Declan, last I heard, was watching the flight prices, which is either a sign of hope or a sign that some men simply don't balance on the first attempt. I mean that with nothing but respect. This has been Inside Vietnam. Take care of yourselves out there.